The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Hospital cast their harsh white glow across the ICU waiting room as my father's voice cut through the sterile air like a blade. "She's not family," he snarled at the nurse behind the desk, his weathered hands gripping the edge of the counter until his knuckles went white. "My son doesn't need visitors from his whatever she is." The nurse, a kind-faced woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back into a neat bun, looked from him to me with confusion etched across her features. I stood there in my civilian clothes, just another face in the crowd of worried visitors, watching my father dismiss me like I was some random stranger off the street. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The smell of antiseptic and the steady beep of monitors filled the silence that followed. Other families in the waiting room had turned to stare at the commotion, their own grief and worry momentarily forgotten in favor of our family drama. My father straightened his shoulders, that familiar posture I knew from childhood when he was about to deliver what he considered the final word on any matter. "My son is a hero," he announced to anyone within earshot, his voice carrying that tone of absolute authority that brooked no argument. "He saved lives in Afghanistan, real lives, not like some people who just play pretend in their little fantasy worlds." The nurse's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Something flickered behind her eyes, a recognition that made my stomach tighten with a mixture of dread and anticipation. She glanced down at the clipboard in her hands, then back up at my father with a look that could have frozen the desert sun. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, her voice steady and professional, "but could you repeat your son's full name for me, just to make sure I have the right patient?" My father puffed out his chest like a peacock displaying its feathers. "Sergeant Marcus Chen, United States Army, 82nd Airborne Division." He practically spat the words as if the very syllables carried the weight of his own pride. "And this," he gestured dismissively in my direction without even looking at me, "is just his sister who thinks she knows something about the military because she works at some desk job for the government." The nurse's pen stopped moving across her clipboard. The sudden stillness in her posture was like watching a predator lock onto its prey. She looked up slowly, and for the first time since this whole confrontation began, her attention wasn't on my father. It was on me. Really on me. Her eyes traveled across my face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle, and I saw the exact moment when the pieces clicked into place. But this public humiliation hadn't started in a hospital waiting room. It had begun 3 months earlier with a phone call that changed everything, delivered over the crackling connection of a satellite phone from halfway around the world. I had been sitting in my small apartment in Arlington, Virginia, the same cramped one-bedroom space I'd called home for the past 4 years. The walls were bare except for a single framed photograph of my brother Marcus in his dress uniform, taken the day he graduated from basic training. I was grading papers from my job as a substitute teacher, red ink bleeding across essays about American history, when my phone rang with that distinctive international tone that always made my heart skip. "Sophia?" Marcus's voice sounded hollow and distant, distorted by the thousands of miles between us. "I need you to know something, in case something happens over here." There was a pause, filled with static and the sound of what might have been helicopters in the background. "Dad still thinks I'm some kind of war hero, doesn't he?" I set down my red pen and pressed the phone closer to my ear. "Marcus, what are you talking about? You are a hero. You're over there serving your country, risking your life." "Sophie." The way he said my name, flat and tired, cut me off mid-sentence. "I've been writing a desk for 8 months. I'm a supply clerk. I count MREs and requisition toilet paper. The most dangerous thing I do is drive to the mess hall." His laugh was bitter and hollow. "Dad's been telling everyone I'm out there kicking down doors and saving lives. He's built this whole fantasy around what he thinks I'm doing over here." The silence that followed felt heavier than the distance between us. I knew my father, knew how he operated, how he crafted narratives that served his vision of what our family should be. Marcus was supposed to be the golden child, the son who fulfilled every dream our father had never been able to achieve himself. And me?
I was supposed to be the supporting character in Marcus's story, the quiet daughter who cheered from the sidelines. When you'd shown interest in the military as a teenager, he'd patted your head indulgently and suggested you consider becoming a military wife instead. The irony was so complete, it might have been funny if it weren't so tragic. 3 days after that phone call from Marcus, I was sitting in a secure briefing room 4 levels below the Pentagon, surrounded by maps of Syria and Afghanistan, listening to a colonel explain why our latest intelligence indicated an imminent threat to American forces in the region.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The room was windowless and sterile, lit by the blue glow of monitors displaying satellite imagery and encrypted communications intercepts. "Agent Chen," the colonel said, turning to face me directly, "your assessment." I studied the data streams flowing across the screens, the pattern recognition software highlighting anomalies in communication traffic, the heat signatures from drone surveillance painting a picture of enemy movement that most people would need hours to decipher. But this was my world, the place where my mind worked with the precision of a surgical instrument. "2 staging areas," I said, pointing to clusters of activity on the satellite feed, "here and here. They're planning a coordinated assault on Forward Operating Base Meridian within the next 72 hours. Vehicle-borne IEDs, followed by small arms fire from these elevated positions." I traced the likely attack routes with my finger, the tactical picture as clear to me as a children's coloring book. The room went quiet, except for the hum of computers and the distant sound of air conditioning. The colonel leaned forward, studying my analysis with the intensity of someone whose decisions carried the weight of human lives. "Confidence level?" 93%, I replied without hesitation. The communication patterns matched the signature from the attack on FOB Lightning last month. Same cell, same methodology, same tactical blind spots we can exploit. The colonel nodded slowly, then reached for his secure phone. Within minutes, he was relaying orders to Theater Command, authorizing the redeployment of assets and the implementation of countermeasures that would save the lives of every soldier stationed at FOB Meridian. It was just another day at the office for me, another crisis averted through the careful application of intelligence analysis and strategic thinking. But to my family, I was Sophia, the substitute teacher, the quiet daughter who couldn't even hold down a real job, who disappeared for weeks at a time on what I claimed were educational conferences and professional development courses. They had no idea that my desk job for the government involved briefing generals, analyzing terrorist communications, and preventing attacks on American forces worldwide. The disconnect between my 2 lives had become so complete that sometimes even I forgot which version of myself was real. At family gatherings, I would sit quietly while Dad regaled relatives with stories of Marcus's supposed heroics in Afghanistan, nodding along with tales that bore no resemblance to the reality of my brother's actual service. Meanwhile, my own work remained classified at levels so high that even acknowledging its existence would have been a federal crime. It was at one of those family gatherings, a 4th of July barbecue at my parents' house in suburban Maryland, that the foundation of my carefully maintained double life began to crack. The backyard was filled with the usual suspects, cousins and uncles and family friends, all gathered around Dad like he was holding court. The smell of grilling hamburgers mixed with the sound of children playing and adults laughing, creating the kind of Norman Rockwell scene that Dad loved to orchestrate. I was sitting on the porch steps, nursing a beer and watching my nephew play with sparklers, when I noticed a new face in the crowd. A woman about Dad's age, wearing a navy cap and carrying herself with the unmistakable bearing of someone who'd spent serious time in uniform. Dad was introducing her around as Admiral Patricia Santos, recently retired, someone he'd known back in the day, though I suspected their actual relationship was more casual than he was letting on. "And this," Dad said, as he reached the porch, gesturing toward me with the casual dismissiveness I'd grown accustomed to, "is my daughter Sophia. She's a teacher. Does some work for the government too, but nothing too exciting. Mostly just paperwork and filing, you know how it is." He actually winked at Admiral Santos, like they were sharing some inside joke about the insignificance of civilian government work. Admiral Santos looked at me with polite interest, the kind of expression people wear when they're being introduced to someone they'll forget in 5 minutes.
"What kind of government work?" she asked, probably just making conversation. Before I could answer, Dad jumped in. "Oh, something with education policy. Very bureaucratic, very boring. Nothing like what Marcus is doing over in Afghanistan." And just like that, the conversation shifted to Marcus and his supposed exploits, leaving me to sit there like a piece of furniture while Dad spun his familiar tales of battlefield heroics that existed only in his imagination. But I caught something in Admiral Santos's expression as Dad talked, a tightness around her eyes that suggested she knew more about combat than Dad ever would. When he paused to take a drink, she turned back to me with renewed interest. "Education policy," she said. "That's important work. A lot of national security implications there." The comment was casual enough that Dad didn't think twice about it, but I heard the subtle probing, the way someone with a security clearance might fish for information without appearing to do so. I just smiled and nodded, giving her the same bland response I'd perfected over the years. "It's not very exciting," she said. "Lots of reports and meetings." Admiral Santos nodded, but I could see her mind working behind her eyes. There was something about the way she was looking at me, like she was trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. The moment passed and the conversation moved on to other topics, but I caught her glancing at me several times throughout the evening with that same thoughtful expression. It wasn't until much later, as I was helping clean up after everyone had gone home, that my mother pulled me aside in the kitchen. She was loading dishes into the dishwasher with the efficient movements of someone who'd been hosting gatherings for decades, her face wearing that expression she got when she was trying to manage family dynamics. "That Admiral Santos seemed very interested in you," she said carefully, not quite looking at me as she spoke. "She asked me a lot of questions about your work after you left." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "What kind of questions?" Mom shrugged, still focused on the dishes. "Oh, just where you went to school, what kind of government work you did, whether you traveled much for your job. I told her the same thing you always tell us, about the education conferences and the boring paperwork." She paused, then looked at me directly for the first time. "Sophia, you would tell us if you were doing something important, wouldn't you? I mean, if you were involved in something that mattered." The question hung in the air between us, loaded with years of unspoken assumptions and carefully maintained lies. I looked at my mother, this woman who'd spent 30 years married to a man who measured worth in military terms, who'd raised 2 children to serve his vision of what success looked like. How could I explain to her that while she'd been apologizing for my boring job, I'd been working to prevent terrorist attacks and protect American lives overseas? "Mom," I said carefully, "what I do is important. Maybe not in the way Dad would understand importance, but it matters." She nodded, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. In her world, importance was measured in concrete achievements, in recognition and praise and public acknowledgement. The kind of work I did, hidden behind layers of classification and bureaucratic cover stories, might as well not exist at all. That night, lying in bed in my childhood room with its faded posters and dusty trophies from high school debate team, I made a decision that would change everything. I was tired of living 2 lives, tired of being invisible in my own family, tired of watching my father build fantasies around Marcus's supposed heroics while dismissing my actual contributions as meaningless paperwork. The next morning, I called my handler at the agency and requested a meeting. Agent Sarah Kim had been my primary contact for the past 3 years, a sharp woman in her 40s who understood better than most the costs of maintaining deep cover. We met at a coffee shop in downtown D.C., just 2 government workers grabbing lunch, nothing unusual about our conversation to any observer. "I need to know what my options are for going at least partially public with my work," I told her after we'd settled into a corner booth with our sandwiches and lattes. Sarah's eyebrows rose slightly. It was the kind of request that complicated things, the kind that required forms and meetings and careful consideration of operational security. "Personal reasons?" she asked. I nodded. "Family issues. My cover story is creating problems at home."
She sipped her coffee thoughtfully. What kind of problems? So I told her about Marcus, about Dad's fantasies and expectations, about the growing disconnect between who I really was and who my family thought I was. I told her about Admiral Santos and the questions, about the feeling that my carefully constructed double life was starting to develop cracks that couldn't be ignored much longer. Sarah listened without interruption, her face giving away nothing. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the streams of tourists and government workers moving along the sidewalk. "Your work has been exemplary," she said finally. "Your analysis prevented 3 major attacks last year alone. The information you provided about the Khartoum cell saved dozens of lives." "But," I prompted, "but your current cover is valuable precisely because it's so complete. Your family's genuine belief in your civilian identity is what makes it work. If that changes—" She shrugged, leaving the implications hanging in the air. I understood what she wasn't saying. In the world of intelligence work, the best covers were the ones that didn't feel like covers at all. My family's dismissal of my supposed government paperwork job was actually a perfect shield for my real activities. No one suspected that the boring daughter who disappeared for educational conferences was actually briefing cabinet-level officials on terrorist threats. "There might be a middle ground," Sarah said eventually. "Your brother's situation creates an opportunity. If he were to get injured, require medical attention?" She let the suggestion hang in the air, unfinished but clear in its implications. I stared at her across the table, understanding dawning like a sunrise. "You want to use Marcus as cover for revelation. I want to give you the opportunity to let your family see who you really are in a controlled environment that doesn't compromise ongoing operations." She leaned forward slightly. "Your brother's unit is rotating back stateside next month. With the right paperwork, the right circumstances, he could end up in a military hospital where certain classified personnel might have reason to visit." The plan she outlined was elegant in its simplicity. A training accident, nothing serious, but enough to require hospitalization. A classified briefing that would bring me to Walter Reed Medical Center in my official capacity, where a chance encounter might finally reveal to my family which of their children was really serving their country in the way that mattered. It was manipulation on a grand scale, the kind of careful orchestration that intelligence agencies excelled at. But it was also an opportunity to finally step out of the shadows, to let my father see that his quiet daughter wasn't quite as insignificant as he'd always assumed. 6 weeks later, Marcus was being airlifted from Ramstein Air Base in Germany to Walter Reed Medical Center in Maryland, his left leg shattered in what the official reports described as a vehicle accident during a routine supply run. The details were classified, but the reality was exactly as Sarah had promised. Serious enough to require extensive medical care, but not life-threatening, and conveniently timed to coincide with a series of high-level briefings that would require my presence at the hospital. I got the call at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, my official phone buzzing with the tone that meant urgent business. The voice on the other end was crisp and professional, conveying information with the efficiency of someone accustomed to delivering bad news. "Agent Chen, your brother has been injured in theater and is being transported to Walter Reed. You're cleared for family visits during off-duty hours, but be aware that your official duties will require your presence at the same facility for the next several days." The timing wasn't coincidental, of course. Nothing in my world ever was. But as I hung up the phone and started getting dressed, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The possibility that my 2 lives might finally converge in a way that wouldn't require me to choose between them. I arrived at Walter Reed just after dawn, the massive medical complex buzzing with the controlled chaos of a facility that never slept. Military personnel in various uniforms moved through the corridors alongside civilian doctors and nurses, creating an atmosphere where my presence could be explained multiple ways, depending on who was asking. Marcus looked smaller than I remembered, lying in the hospital bed with his leg elevated and surrounded by the beeping machines that monitored his vital signs. His face was pale but alert,
and he managed a weak smile when he saw me approaching. "Hey, Sophie," he said, his voice hoarse from the pain medication. "Fancy meeting you here." I pulled up a chair beside his bed, noting the way his eyes tracked the movement of medical personnel in the hallway beyond his room. Even injured, Marcus was observant, a trait that had served him well in his actual military role, even if it wasn't the glamorous combat position Dad imagined. "How are you feeling?" I asked, though I already knew the answer from the medical reports I'd read during my official briefing 2 hours earlier. "Like I got hit by a truck," he replied, then laughed at his own joke. "Actually, it was more like I got hit by a Humvee that got hit by an IED. Does Dad know?" I nodded. "Mom called me this morning. They're driving down from Baltimore. Should be here in a few hours." Marcus closed his eyes, and for a moment, I thought he might have drifted off to sleep. But when he opened them again, there was something different in his expression, a clarity that cut through the haze of medication. "Sophie, there's something I need to tell you before they get here, about what really happened." I leaned closer, though I suspected I already knew what he was going to say. The official reports had been sanitized for public consumption, but I'd seen the classified version, the one that painted a very different picture of my brother's service than what Dad had been telling everyone. "It wasn't a routine supply run," Marcus said quietly. "I volunteered to drive a medical evacuation convoy to pick up wounded from a forward position that was under fire. The IED was meant for the convoy coming back, the one carrying injured soldiers who couldn't defend themselves." He paused, his breathing shallow, and I could see the cost of telling the story. I saw the blast signature, recognized the pattern from intelligence briefings. I knew if we took the normal route back, we'd lose everyone in that convoy. So I took point, drew the blast away from the medical vehicles. The pieces of the classified report suddenly made sense. Marcus hadn't been injured in a random accident during a supply run. He had deliberately put himself in harm's way to protect a convoy full of wounded soldiers, using tactical knowledge that came from briefings about enemy patterns and attack methodologies. "Marcus," I said softly, "that intelligence briefing you mentioned, do you remember who gave it?" He looked at me strangely, his pain medication-fogged brain working to process the question. "It was some analyst from D.C., Agent something or other. Why?" I didn't answer. Couldn't answer, because footsteps in the hallway announced the arrival of our parents. Dad's voice carried ahead of him that familiar, authoritative tone he used when he was trying to take charge of a situation. "I want to speak to whoever's in charge here. My son is a hero, and I want to make sure he's getting the best possible care." The nurse at the station, the same graying woman who would later play such a crucial role in what was about to unfold, looked up at her paperwork with professional patience.
Of course, sir. Your son is receiving excellent care. He's in room 314, but visiting hours don't officially start until... Visiting hours don't apply to family members of wounded warriors, Dad interrupted, his voice carrying that tone of absolute certainty that brooked no argument. "My son was injured serving his country. We're going to see him now." I heard Marcus sigh from his hospital bed, the sound of someone who'd grown tired of living up to other people's expectations. "Here we go," he murmured. "Dad's going to turn this into his own personal military operation." Our parents appeared in the doorway, Dad in his customary khakis and pressed shirt that somehow managed to look like a uniform even in civilian clothes. Mom trailing behind with that expression she wore when she was trying to manage Dad's intensity. They both looked older than I remembered, the stress of the past few hours etched into the lines around their eyes. "Marcus," Dad said, his voice thick with emotion as he strode across the room to grip his son's hand. "How are you holding up, soldier?" "I'm okay, Dad," Marcus replied, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he braced himself for what he knew was coming. Dad turned to survey the room, taking in the medical equipment and the institutional setting with the critical eye of someone accustomed to inspecting facilities. "They're taking good care of you here? Because if they're not, I can make some calls. I still have contacts. People owe me favors." "Dad, really, I'm fine," Marcus said. But Dad was already moving on, his attention shifting to the nurse who'd appeared in the doorway to check on the commotion. "You're taking care of my son?" Dad asked, his tone just shy of demanding. "He's a war hero, saved lives in Afghanistan. I want to make sure he's getting priority treatment." The nurse, whose name tag read Lieutenant Commander Patricia Hayes, RN, looked at Dad with the kind of professional patience that came from years of dealing with worried family members. But there was something else in her expression, a sharpness that suggested she was paying closer attention to Dad's words than her polite smile indicated. "Your son is receiving excellent care, sir. All of our patients do." "Well, good," Dad said, apparently satisfied that he'd established his authority in the situation. "Because Marcus here is the real deal. You probably see a lot of soldiers who think they're heroes, but my boy actually saved lives over there, risked his own life to protect his fellow Americans." Lieutenant Commander Hayes nodded politely, but I caught the way her eyes flicked toward me, standing quietly in the corner of the room. There was recognition there, the kind that made my pulse quicken and my professional instincts go on high alert. "That's wonderful," she said. "We're honored to care for him. And you are?" "Colonel Robert Chen, retired," Dad said, straightening his shoulders in that way that announced his military credentials to anyone within earshot. 22 years of service. I taught this boy everything he knows about being a soldier. And this is my daughter," Mom said, gesturing toward me with the same casual dismissal that had characterized my role and family introductions for as long as I could remember. "Sophia. She works for the government too, but nothing as exciting as what Marcus does. More of a desk job." Lieutenant Commander Hayes looked at me again, and this time the recognition in her eyes was unmistakable. She knew exactly who I was, and more importantly, she knew what I did for a living. In that moment, I realized that Sarah's carefully orchestrated plan was about to unfold in ways that none of us had anticipated. "A desk job," the nurse repeated, her voice carefully neutral. "What kind of work?" "Oh, education policy," Mom said, using the cover story I'd maintained for so many years. "Very bureaucratic, lots of meetings and paperwork, nothing too important." Dad nodded along with Mom's explanation, adding his own dismissive commentary. "Sophie here thinks she understands the military because she shuffles papers in Washington. But real military service, what Marcus does, that takes courage, that takes sacrifice." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken tension. Lieutenant Commander Hayes looked from Dad to me and back again, her expression unreadable, but her posture suggesting someone who was processing information and making decisions. I could practically see the gears turning in her head as she considered how to handle what she knew versus what my family believed. "Well," she said finally, "I should let you folks visit with your son. I'll be back to check on him in a little while." She started to leave, then paused at the doorway and looked back at me one more time. "Miss Chen, would you mind stepping out into the hallway with me for a moment? I have some questions about your brother's medical history." It was a transparent excuse, the kind of minor deception that military personnel excelled at when they needed to manage information flow. Dad didn't think twice about it, already turning his attention back to Marcus and launching into questions about his injuries and his prognosis. But I caught the slight emphasis on my last name, the way Lieutenant Commander Hayes had pronounced it with the kind of precision that suggested she knew exactly why it was significant. I followed her out into the hallway, my heart racing with anticipation and anxiety in equal measure. The corridor was busy with the constant flow of medical personnel and visitors, creating enough background noise to mask quiet conversations. Lieutenant Commander Hayes led me to a small alcove near the nurses' station where we could talk without being overheard. "Agent Chen," she said quietly, using my real title for the first time. "I thought that was you." The use of my operational designation hit me like a physical blow. After years of being dismissed and diminished, having someone acknowledge who I really was felt both terrifying and exhilarating. "You know who I am?" Lieutenant Commander Hayes smiled, and for the first time since I'd met her, the expression seemed genuine rather than professional. "I was the senior medical officer at Kandahar Airfield last year when you provided the intelligence that prevented the attack on our field hospital. 37 medical personnel and 43 wounded soldiers were in that facility when the terrorists planned to hit it." The memory came flooding back, satellite imagery showing unusual vehicle movements near the airfield, communication intercepts indicating a planned assault on medical facilities, the race against time to get warnings to personnel on the ground.
It had been one of those cases where success was measured by what didn't happen, where preventing disaster meant that most people would never know how close they had come to tragedy. "You saved our lives," Lieutenant Commander Hayes continued. "All of us. We never knew who provided that intelligence, but the briefing officers made it clear that without that warning, we'd have lost everyone in the hospital." I felt something shift inside me, a recognition of my own value that I'd been missing for years. This was what my work meant. This was why the long hours and the secrecy and the invisible victories mattered. Real people with real families were alive because of what I did in those sterile briefing rooms 4 levels below the Pentagon. "Your father doesn't know," Lieutenant Commander Hayes said. It wasn't a question. I shook my head. "My family thinks I'm a substitute teacher who does boring paperwork for the Department of Education."
When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of someone who understood the cost of service in ways that couldn't be measured in ribbons and medals. "Agent Chen, what you do matters. What you've done has saved more lives than most combat veterans will save in their entire careers. Your family should know that." "My family thinks my brother is the war hero," I said, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. "They think I'm the disappointment who couldn't even hold down a real teaching job." Lieutenant Commander Hayes glanced back toward Marcus's room, where we could hear Dad holding forth on military tradition and the importance of service to country. "Your brother did save those soldiers in that convoy," she said. "The medical evacuation he protected was carrying Marines from my unit. His actions were genuinely heroic." I felt a surge of pride for Marcus, genuine admiration for the courage he'd shown. But it was tempered by the familiar sting of comparison, the knowledge that his single act of heroism would be celebrated while my years of service remained invisible. "But Agent Chen," Lieutenant Commander Hayes continued, "the intelligence briefing that gave your brother the tactical knowledge to recognize that IED pattern and avoid the trap, that briefing was based on analysis you provided. Your work made his heroism possible." The connection hit me like lightning. The pattern recognition software I'd developed, the communication intercepts I'd analyzed, the threat assessments I'd compiled, all of it had filtered down through official channels to forward operating bases where soldiers like Marcus received briefings on enemy tactics and attack methodologies. My invisible work had given my brother the knowledge he needed to save those lives. "Your father is in there bragging about his son's heroism," Lieutenant Commander Hayes said, "but he has no idea that both of his children are heroes. The difference is that one of them gets recognition, while the other one works in the shadows to make that recognition possible." We stood there in the hospital corridor, surrounded by the controlled chaos of a medical facility that never slept, and I felt something fundamental shift in my understanding of my own worth. For years, I'd measured my value against my family's expectations, against my father's narrow definition of what military service looked like. But standing there with Lieutenant Commander Hayes, a woman whose life I'd helped save, I finally understood that impact wasn't always visible, that the most important work often happened in silence. "What are you going to do?" she asked. I looked back toward Marcus's room, where I could see Dad gesturing emphatically as he told some story about military tradition, probably the same one he'd been telling for years, about the importance of serving your country with honor. Mom was nodding along, playing her familiar role as the supportive audience for Dad's monologues. "I don't know," I admitted. "My work is classified. I can't just tell them what I really do." Lieutenant Commander Hayes smiled again, and this time there was something almost mischievous in her expression. "Agent Chen, your father seems very proud of his military service and very vocal about his son's heroism. What do you think would happen if someone with sufficient authority were to correct some of his assumptions about which of his children was really serving their country?" The implication was clear, and the possibilities made my pulse quicken. Lieutenant Commander Hayes wasn't just a nurse. She was a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy, someone with both the rank and the credibility to speak with authority about military service and sacrifice. More importantly, she was someone who had direct, personal knowledge of my work and its impact. "I can't ask you to do that," I said, though even as I spoke the words, I could feel the temptation building.
After years of silence, the possibility of having my family understand who I really was felt like oxygen after a lifetime of holding my breath. "You're not asking," Lieutenant Commander replied. "I'm volunteering. Your father is about to learn something about his daughter that might surprise him." Before I could respond, she was walking back toward Marcus's room with the purposeful stride of someone who'd made a decision. I followed behind, my heart hammering against my ribs as I tried to prepare for whatever was about to unfold. Dad was in the middle of another story when we returned, something about the importance of physical courage and mental toughness in military service. Marcus looked tired, his face pale against the white hospital pillows, but he was listening with the patient attention of someone who'd heard these lectures many times before. "Excuse me," Lieutenant Commander Hayes said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that automatically commanded attention. "Colonel Chen, might I have a word with you?" Dad turned toward her with interest, probably assuming she wanted to discuss Marcus's care or perhaps acknowledge his service record. He straightened his shoulders in that familiar way, preparing to receive what he assumed would be praise for his family's military legacy. "Of course," he said, his voice carrying that tone of magnanimous authority he used when speaking to what he perceived as subordinates. "What can I do for you, Lieutenant Commander?" Lieutenant Commander Hayes stepped fully into the room, her posture radiating the kind of professional confidence that came from years of military service. "I wanted to thank you personally for your family's service to our country." Dad's chest puffed out with pride. "Well, thank you. It's an honor to serve. Marcus here has really distinguished himself overseas, and I like to think I taught him something about duty and sacrifice during my own time in uniform." "Yes," Lieutenant Commander Hayes said, her voice carefully measured. "Your son's actions in protecting that medical convoy were indeed heroic. He saved the lives of several Marines from my unit." The words hit the room like a physical force. Dad's eyes widened with surprise and pride, while Mom gasped audibly from her chair beside Marcus's bed. Even Marcus himself looked startled, his pain medication-fogged brain working to process what the nurse had just revealed. "Your unit?" Dad asked, his voice tight with excitement. "You were there? You saw what Marcus did?" Lieutenant Commander Hayes nodded gravely. "I was the senior medical officer at Kandahar Airfield. The Marines your son protected were part of a medical evacuation convoy bringing wounded from a forward position under fire. Without his quick thinking and tactical knowledge, we would have lost everyone in that convoy." Dad turned to look at Marcus with an expression of such pure pride and amazement that it was almost painful to witness. "Marcus, you never told us you saved Marines. You never mentioned—" "Dad, I was just doing my job," Marcus interrupted weakly. But Dad was already turning back to Lieutenant Commander Hayes with hungry anticipation. "Tell me everything," he demanded. "I want to know exactly what my son did over there." Lieutenant Commander Hayes glanced at me briefly, and I caught the subtle question in her eyes. This was my moment, my chance to step forward and claim my place in the story. But something held me back, some deeply ingrained habit of invisibility that made me retreat to the corner of the room instead. "Your son demonstrated exceptional courage," Lieutenant Commander Hayes continued. "But Colonel Chen, what made his heroism possible was the intelligence briefing he'd received earlier that day. Someone had provided detailed analysis of enemy attack patterns, tactical assessments that allowed soldiers like Marcus to recognize threats and respond appropriately." Dad nodded along eagerly, hanging on every word. "Intelligence is crucial in modern warfare. I always told Marcus to pay attention to his briefings, to respect the work that went into gathering that information. The intelligence that saved your son's life, and the lives of those Marines, came from a very specific source," Lieutenant Commander Hayes said, her voice taking on a different quality, something that made everyone in the room lean forward slightly. "It came from analysis provided by Agent Sophia Chen." The silence that followed was so complete it seemed to have physical weight. I could hear the steady beep of Marcus's heart monitor, the distant sound of footsteps in the corridor, the whisker of air conditioning through the vents overhead. But from the 4 other people in that room, there was nothing but stunned silence. Dad's face went through a series of expressions, confusion, denial, and finally a kind of dawning horror as the implications began to sink in. "Agent? What?" Lieutenant Commander Hayes turned to look at me directly, and I felt every eye in the room follow her gaze. Colonel Chen, your daughter isn't a substitute teacher who does paperwork for the Department of Education. She's a senior intelligence analyst with the Defense Intelligence Agency. Her official classification level is above my clearance grade. The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Dad's mouth opened and closed several times without producing sound, while Mom looked back and forth between Lieutenant Commander Hayes and me with growing bewilderment. "That's impossible," Dad said finally, his voice weak and uncertain. "Sophia teaches high school students. She does educational conferences. She's not." "Colonel Chen," Lieutenant Commander Hayes said, her voice gentle but firm, "your daughter has prevented more terrorist attacks on American forces than any single analyst in her division. The intelligence she provided last year alone saved the lives of over 300 service members, including the 37 medical personnel and 43 wounded soldiers who were in my field hospital when terrorists planned to attack it." I watched my father's face as he tried to process this information, tried to reconcile the daughter he'd dismissed for years with the person Lieutenant Commander Hayes was describing. The cognitive dissonance was written across his features like words on a page. "But she's never said anything," Mom protested, her voice high and strained. "She's never mentioned any of this. How could we not know?" "Because her work is classified at levels that require complete operational security," Lieutenant Commander Hayes explained. "Agent Chen maintains deep cover even with her family. Her civilian identity as an educational consultant provides perfect camouflage for someone who travels frequently to briefing locations and maintains irregular schedules." Marcus was staring at me from his hospital bed with an expression I'd never seen before, something that might have been recognition mixed with profound respect. "Sophie," he said quietly, "is this true? Are you really—" I looked around the room at my family, at these people who'd known me my entire life but had never really seen me. The weight of years of silence pressed down on my shoulders, but for the first time, I felt strong enough to carry it. "Yes," I said simply, "it's true." Dad made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob, running his hands through his graying hair. "All this time," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "all this time you've—" "Saving lives," Lieutenant Commander Hayes finished, "protecting American forces, serving her country with distinction and honor." The silence stretched out again, but this time it felt different, less shocked, more contemplative, as if everyone in the room was trying to rearrange their understanding of reality to accommodate this new information. "The briefing that gave Marcus the tactical knowledge to save those Marines," Lieutenant Commander Hayes continued, "was based on communication intercepts and pattern analysis that Agent Chen compiled. Her work made his heroism possible. Both of your children are war heroes, Colonel Chen. The difference is that one of them operates in the shadows so that the other can serve in the light." Dad was looking at me now with an expression I'd never seen before, something that went beyond simple surprise into territory I couldn't quite identify. It wasn't pride exactly, but it wasn't disappointment either. It was more like he was seeing me for the first time, really seeing me, and trying to understand how he'd missed so much for so long. "Sophia," he said, my name coming out rough and uncertain, "is this why you disappear for weeks at a time? The conferences? The travel?" "Classified briefings," I confirmed. "Threat assessments for theater commanders, strategic planning sessions, the kind of work that can't be discussed, even with family." Mom was crying now, quiet tears streaming down her cheeks as she looked back and forth between Marcus and me. "I don't understand," she said. "How could we not know? How could we not see?" "Because I needed you not to see," I said gently. "My cover story only works if it's completely believable. If my own family thought I was just a substitute teacher doing boring government paperwork, then no one else would suspect otherwise." Lieutenant Commander Hayes stepped forward, her expression compassionate but firm. "Mrs. Chen, your daughter has made sacrifices for her country that most people will never understand. She's given up recognition, advancement opportunities, even the acknowledgement of her own family,
all to maintain the operational security that keeps her work effective. The room fell quiet again as everyone absorbed this information. I could see Dad struggling with concepts that challenged everything he thought he understood about military service and family loyalty. His entire worldview had been built on the idea that recognition and public acknowledgement were the measures of worth. But here was his daughter, who'd been serving with distinction while deliberately remaining invisible. The substitute teaching, Dad said slowly, working through the logic, that was all fake? Not fake, I corrected. I do actually teach, sometimes. It's part of my cover identity. But my real job involves analyzing terrorist communications, predicting attack patterns, and briefing senior military leadership on threats to American forces worldwide. Marcus shifted in his hospital bed, wincing slightly as the movement aggravated his injuries. Sophie, that briefing I got about IED signatures and attack methodologies, that was your work? I nodded.
Among other things, the pattern recognition algorithms I developed have been distributed to forward operating bases throughout the Middle East. They help soldiers like you identify threats and avoid ambushes. Jesus, Marcus breathed, his voice filled with something that sounded like awe. All this time, I thought you were the one who didn't understand military service, but you've been protecting all of us. Dad was still staring at me, his expression cycling through emotions I couldn't fully read. Sophia, he said finally, why didn't you tell us? Why let us think? Because my work is classified, I said simply. Because lives depend on operational security. Because the best cover is one that doesn't feel like a cover at all. Lieutenant Commander Hayes cleared her throat softly. Colonel Chen, if I may, there's something else you should understand about your daughter's service. The work she does isn't just important, it's irreplaceable. There are maybe a dozen people in the entire intelligence community who have her level of clearance and analytical capability. She's briefed cabinet members, provided strategic assessments to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and personally prevented attacks that would have killed hundreds of American service members. The weight of this revelation seemed to settle over Dad like a heavy blanket. He sat down heavily in the visitor's chair, his face pale and drawn. All those years, he said, his voice thick with emotion. All those years I was telling people about Marcus's service, bragging about having a son in the military. And you were doing her job, Lieutenant Commander Hayes finished, serving her country, protecting lives, including your son's. I watched my father process this information, watched him confront the reality that his quiet daughter wasn't the failure he'd assumed her to be. The cognitive dissonance was painful to witness, but there was something else there too, something that might have been the beginning of respect. I don't understand how this is possible, Mom said, her voice still shaky with tears. How could someone so young have so much responsibility? How could we not know? Because Agent Chen is exceptionally good at her job, Lieutenant Commander Hayes replied, because she's maintained perfect operational security for years, and because she's made personal sacrifices that most people wouldn't be willing to make. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion in the hallway outside Marcus's room, voices, authoritative and urgent, growing closer. Lieutenant Commander Hayes glanced toward the door with an expression that suggested she recognized the significance of whatever was happening. Agent Chen, she said quietly, I believe you're about to have some official visitors. Before I could ask what she meant, 3 people in military uniforms appeared in the doorway. The lead figure was a woman with silver hair and the unmistakable bearing of senior command authority. Behind her were 2 men, one wearing the uniform of a Marine colonel, the other in Navy dress whites with enough ribbons on his chest to suggest extensive combat experience. Agent Chen, the lead figure said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that automatically commanded attention. I'm General Patricia Morrison, Deputy Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. We need to speak with you. The room went dead silent. Dad's eyes widened as he took in the 3-star insignia on General Morrison's uniform, while Mom actually gasped audibly. Even Marcus, despite his pain medication, seemed to understand the significance of having a general appear in his hospital room. General Morrison's gaze swept across my family, taking in their shocked expressions with the kind of professional assessment that came from years of reading people and situations. "I'm sorry to interrupt your family time, Agent Chen, but we have a developing situation that requires your immediate attention." I felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with crisis response, my professional instincts overriding the personal drama of the past hour. "What's the nature of the threat?" "Intelligence intercepts from Syria indicate a coordinated attack on multiple American installations within the next 48 hours, General Morrison said. "We need your pattern analysis and tactical assessment immediately." The transformation was instantaneous and complete. One moment, I was Sophia, the substitute teacher, standing awkwardly in a hospital room while my family struggled to understand who I really was. The next moment, I was Agent Chen, senior intelligence analyst, responding to a direct order from a 3-star general. "What's the scope of the threat?" I asked, my voice taking on the crisp professionalism that came with years of high-stakes briefings. 6 installations, 3 countries, coordinated timing, the Marine Colonel replied. "We have partial communication intercepts, but need someone with your analytical capabilities to fill in the gaps." I glanced around the room at my family, all of whom were watching this exchange with expressions of complete bewilderment. Dad looked like he was witnessing something from another world, while Mom seemed to be struggling with the basic reality of what she was seeing. "I need 20 minutes to brief my team and arrange transportation," I said to General Morrison. "You have 10, she replied. "The situation is deteriorating rapidly." Lieutenant Commander Hayes stepped forward, her expression grave. "General Morrison, if I may, Agent Chen's family has just learned about her actual service record. They're still processing the information." General Morrison looked at my parents with something that might have been sympathy, then back at me with the kind of understanding that came from years of managing personnel with families who didn't fully understand their work. "Agent Chen, your family is welcome to remain here as long as needed. Lieutenant Commander Hayes will ensure they have everything they require." She turned to address Dad directly, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Colonel Chen, your daughter is one of the most valuable intelligence assets in the United States military. Her work saves lives every day. You should be very proud." Dad's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. He was staring at General Morrison like she was an apparition, struggling to reconcile the reality of a 3-star general praising his daughter with his own assumptions about her value and importance. "I have to go," I said, looking around the room at my family. "This is what I do. This is who I am." Marcus reached out from his hospital bed and caught my hand as I passed. "Sophie," he said quietly, I'm sorry we never saw you." I squeezed his hand briefly. "Take care of yourself, Marcus. I'm proud of what you did over there." As I moved toward the door, I caught Dad's eye one last time.
He looked like a man whose entire world had been turned upside down, but there was something else in his expression now, something that might have been the beginning of recognition. "Sophia," he called out as I reached the doorway. I turned back to face him. This man who'd spent my entire life dismissing my achievements and diminishing my worth. For a moment, we just looked at each other across the hospital room, years of misunderstanding hanging in the air between us. "Come back safe," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. It wasn't an apology, wasn't an acknowledgement of all the years of dismissal and condescension, but it was something, a crack in the wall he'd built around his understanding of what military service looked like. For now, it was enough. "I will," I promised, then turned and followed General Morrison out of the room. As we walked down the hospital corridor, our footsteps echoing off the polished floors, I could hear the murmur of voices from Marcus's room behind us. My family, finally beginning to understand who I really was, trying to process years of carefully maintained deception. "Agent Chen," General Morrison said as we waited for the elevator, "I hope you understand that revealing your identity to your family creates certain security considerations." "Yes, ma'am, I understand the implications." "Good, because after we deal with this current threat, we're going to need to have a serious discussion about your operational status and cover identity. The work you do is too important to compromise, but family relationships are important too." The elevator arrived, and as the doors closed behind us, I caught one last glimpse of the corridor where my 2 lives had finally, irrevocably converged.
For better or worse, there was no going back to the careful deception I'd maintained for so long. 6 hours later, I was standing in a secure briefing room in the Pentagon, surrounded by monitors displaying satellite imagery from Syria and Afghanistan. The pattern analysis I'd provided had identified the coordinated attack plan, and American forces were already repositioning to neutralize the threat. It was just another day at the office, just another crisis averted through the careful application of intelligence and strategic thinking. But this time felt different. This time, my family knew who I really was, knew what I actually did when I disappeared for days at a time. The weight of secrecy that I'd carried for years had been lifted, replaced by something else entirely, the possibility of being seen and understood for who I truly was. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. When I opened it, I saw a simple message that made my throat tighten with emotion. "Your father asked me to tell you that he's proud of both his children. Come visit when you can. Lieutenant Commander Hayes." I stared at the message for a long moment, feeling something fundamental shift in my understanding of family and recognition and worth. For years, I'd measured my value against my father's narrow definition of military service, against his public acknowledgement and praise. But standing in that briefing room, surrounded by the evidence of my own impact and importance, I finally understood that validation didn't always come in the form you expected. Sometimes it came in a hospital room, delivered by a nurse who'd witnessed the results of your work firsthand. Sometimes it came from a 3-star general who interrupted a family visit because she needed your specific expertise. Sometimes it came in the form of a text message from someone who'd seen your father finally begin to understand what you'd been doing all along. The crisis in Syria was resolved within 18 hours. American installations remained secure, attacks were prevented, and lives were saved. It was the kind of invisible victory I'd grown accustomed to, the kind of success that would never make headlines, but that meant everything to the families of the soldiers who came home safely. But this time, when I finally made it back to Walter Reed Medical Center to check on Marcus, I wasn't walking into a room full of people who saw me as the family disappointment. I was walking into a room where, for the first time in my life, my father stood up when I entered. "Sophia," he said, his voice carrying a weight I'd never heard before. How did it go? It was such a simple question, but it contained multitudes. It was acknowledgement, recognition, respect. It was the understanding that what I did mattered, that my work had consequences, that my service was worthy of attention and concern. "It went well," I replied. "The threat has been neutralized." Dad nodded seriously, as if he finally understood the gravity of what that meant. "Good, that's good." We stood there for a moment, father and daughter, both of us struggling with years of misunderstanding and misconnections. It would take time to rebuild what had been damaged, time to learn how to see each other clearly. But for the first time in my life, I believed it was possible. Marcus was awake and looking much better, the color returned to his face and the alertness back in his eyes. "Hey, Sophie," he said with a grin, "I heard you saved the world again." "Just part of the job," I replied, but I was smiling too. Lieutenant Commander Hayes appeared in the doorway, her expression warm with the satisfaction of someone who'd accomplished exactly what she had set out to do. Agent Chen said, as we waited for the elevator, "I wanted to thank you again, for everything." I looked around the room at my family, at these people who finally knew who I really was, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The possibility of being seen and understood for who I truly was. "Thank you," I said to Lieutenant Commander Hayes, "for helping them understand." She smiled. Sometimes the truth just needs the right messenger. As I settled into the visitor's chair beside Marcus's bed, listening to my parents ask careful, respectful questions about my work, I realized that everything had changed, not just in terms of family dynamics or professional recognition, but in terms of my own understanding of what it meant to serve with honor. For years, I'd thought that recognition required visibility, that respect demanded acknowledgement, that worth needed to be proven through public demonstration.
But standing in that briefing room surrounded by the evidence of my own impact and importance, I finally understood that most important victories were often the quiet ones, the ones that happened in shadows and silence. My father had spent his entire life teaching me about military tradition and the importance of serving your country with distinction. In the end, it turned out I'd been living up to those ideals all along. I'd just been doing it in a way he'd never learned to see. But now he could see it. Now they all could. And that made all the years of silence and sacrifice worthwhile. The story of Agent Sophia Chen wasn't over. It was just beginning to be told. The morning after General Morrison's emergency briefing, I found myself sitting in a conference room on the 7th floor of the Pentagon, watching the sunrise paint the Potomac River gold through floor-to-ceiling windows. The Syria crisis had been contained, but the ripple effects of my family learning about my true identity were just beginning to unfold in ways I hadn't anticipated. Agent Sarah Kim sat across from me, her usually immaculate appearance showing signs of the sleepless night we'd all endured. Steam rose from her coffee cup as she reviewed a stack of classified documents, each one marked with security classifications that would have made my father's head spin if he'd known what they contained. The good news is that your family's reaction appears to be contained. No calls to reporters, no social media posts, no discussions with neighbors. Lieutenant Commander Hayes did an excellent job managing the disclosure. I nodded, though I wasn't sure how I felt about my family's revelation being described in terms of damage control. And the bad news? Sarah finally looked up, her expression carrying the weight of decisions that would reshape my entire operational framework. The bad news is that your deep cover identity is essentially compromised, not publicly, not in ways that threaten national security, but compromised nonetheless. We need to make some adjustments. The implications hit me like a physical blow. For 6 years, my carefully constructed civilian identity had provided perfect camouflage for some of the most sensitive intelligence work in the government. The boring substitute teacher who did educational consulting was the ideal explanation for irregular schedules, frequent travel, and the kind of security clearances that required background investigations that made FBI polygraph tests look like casual conversations.
What kind of adjustments? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Sarah spread several documents across the conference table, each one representing a different path forward for my career and my life. Option 1, full extraction. New identity, new location, complete separation from your current life. You'd continue your analytical work, but with a different cover story and no family contact. The thought of losing my family just as I'd finally found a way to connect with them felt like being offered a drink of water after years in the desert, only to have it snatched away before I could taste it. That seems extreme. Option 2, Sarah continued, modified cover. We maintain your current identity, but adjust your official role to something that allows for more openness about your government work. Senior policy advisor, strategic consultant, something that explains the security clearances without revealing the specifics of what you do. I studied the paperwork she'd laid out, forms and authorizations that would fundamentally alter the structure of my professional life. What would that mean for my operational effectiveness? Reduced fieldwork, more analytical support from Washington. You'd still be doing the same kind of pattern recognition and threat assessment, but from a more bureaucratic position that's easier to explain to civilian contacts. Sarah pulled out a third folder, this one thicker than the others and marked with security classifications I rarely saw outside of the most sensitive briefings. Option 3 is more complex. We're calling it controlled transparency. You maintain your current operational capacity, but with limited family disclosure under strict security protocols. This was new territory, the kind of creative solution that intelligence agencies developed when standard procedures didn't fit the situation. How would that work? Your family signs security agreements, undergoes limited background checks, and receives basic briefings on operational security. They learn enough about your work to understand its importance without learning details that could compromise ongoing operations. The idea was intriguing, but also terrifying.
The thought of my parents sitting through security briefings, learning about the world I inhabited professionally, felt like two universes colliding in ways that might destroy both. There are risks, Sarah admitted. Your father's military background helps, but civilian family members with knowledge of classified operations present unique security challenges. On the other hand, your psychological evaluations have consistently noted the stress you experience from maintaining complete separation between your professional and personal identities. I thought about the years I'd spent living two completely different lives, the exhaustion of constantly monitoring every word and action to maintain my cover story. The weight of that deception had been slowly crushing me, making me feel like a stranger in my own family. But the alternative, bringing them into my world even partially, carried risks I wasn't sure I was prepared to accept. How long do I have to decide? 72 hours, Sarah said. The director wants a recommendation by Friday morning. As if summoned by her words, my personal phone buzzed with an incoming text message. I glanced at the screen and saw my mother's name, followed by words that made my stomach tighten with anxiety. Your father wants to have dinner tonight. Family meeting. Can you come? The timing felt like cosmic irony. Here I was, sitting in one of the most secure buildings in the world, discussing the future of my career in national intelligence, while my family was apparently processing yesterday's revelations in their own way. The collision of my two worlds was accelerating in ways that felt increasingly beyond my control. Family emergency? Sarah asked, noting my expression. Family meeting, I corrected. My father wants to talk. Sarah's eyebrows rose slightly. In her world, families were variables to be managed, potential security risks to be assessed and contained. The idea of a family meeting probably seemed both quaint and potentially dangerous. Do you need support for that conversation? I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. What kind of support? Are you going to send a briefing officer to help me explain counterterrorism analysis to my mother? If necessary, Sarah replied, and I realized she wasn't entirely joking. Agent Chen, your family's reaction to this information could have implications beyond your personal relationships. If they decide to share what they've learned, if they can't handle the security requirements, if they become a liability... She didn't need to finish the sentence. I understood the implications. My family's knowledge of my real work made them potential security risks, people who needed to be monitored and managed like any other aspect of a classified operation. I'll handle it, I said, though I wasn't entirely sure what handling it would involve. Sarah gathered up her documents with the efficiency of someone accustomed to making difficult situations disappear into filing cabinets. Agent Chen, I need you to understand something. What happened yesterday at the hospital was unprecedented. We don't have established protocols for family members learning about deep cover operations through chance encounters with affected personnel. The uniqueness of my situation was both liberating and terrifying. There was no playbook for this, no standard operating procedure that dictated how to proceed when your carefully constructed double life suddenly became a triangle with your family standing at the third point. Lieutenant Commander Hayes acted appropriately given the circumstances, Sarah continued. But her decision to reveal your identity created a situation we're still assessing. The fact that she had direct knowledge of your work's impact made her testimony particularly compelling, but it also meant that your family learned about your service in the most dramatic way possible. I thought about the look on my father's face when Lieutenant Commander Hayes had explained how my intelligence analysis had saved lives, including the Marines my brother had protected. The shock and recognition and something that might have been pride, all mixed together in an expression I'd never seen before. What's your recommendation? I asked. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. studying me with the kind of analytical intensity she usually reserved for threat assessments and operational planning. Personally, I think the controlled transparency option offers the best balance of operational security and personal stability. Your psychological profiles indicate that maintaining complete separation between your identities is becoming increasingly difficult. She paused, then added something that surprised me with its apparent concern for my well-being. Agent Chen, you're one of the most effective analysts we've ever worked with. Your pattern recognition capabilities are exceptional. Your threat assessments are consistently accurate, and your strategic recommendations have prevented more attacks than anyone outside this building will ever know. But you're also carrying a psychological burden that most deep cover operatives don't face. What do you mean? Most deep cover operations involve creating false identities to infiltrate hostile organizations or gather intelligence in foreign countries. Your situation is different. You're not pretending to be someone else to fool enemies. You're pretending to be someone else to fool the people who love you most. The observation hit me with unexpected force. I'd never thought of my cover identity in those terms, never considered the psychological cost of lying to my family as fundamentally different from the deception required for other types of intelligence work. The stress of maintaining that kind of deception with family members can be more damaging than the pressure of operating in hostile territory. At least when you're deceiving enemies, you understand that the deception serves a clear operational purpose. When you're deceiving family, the lines between professional necessity and personal protection become blurred.
I left the Pentagon that afternoon with my head spinning from the implications of decisions that would reshape every aspect of my life. The drive from Washington to my parents' house in suburban Maryland gave me time to think, but the closer I got to the familiar streets of my childhood, the more surreal the situation became. My phone rang as I pulled into my parents' driveway, the secure line that meant official business. I glanced at the caller ID and saw General Morrison's name, which meant either very good news or very bad news, with no middle ground between them. Agent Chen. Her voice was crisp and professional, but I caught an undertone of something that might have been concern. I wanted to brief you on the aftermath of yesterday's operation before you meet with your family. I stayed in my car, engine idling, while she provided details that would have been classified at levels my family couldn't imagine. The coordinated attacks in Syria had been completely neutralized, with no American casualties and minimal collateral damage. My analysis had been accurate down to timing and target selection, allowing forces to intercept the attacks before they could be launched. The intelligence you provided saved approximately 400 American personnel, General Morrison said. The tactical adjustments based on your recommendations prevented what would have been the most successful coordinated attack on American installations in the region this year. The numbers were just statistics until I considered what they represented. 400 families who wouldn't receive notification visits, 400 soldiers who would return home safely, 400 lives that continued because of analysis I'd performed in a windowless room in the Pentagon. "Thank you, ma'am," I said, though the words felt inadequate for the gravity of what she was describing. "Agent Chen, there's something else you should know. Your brother's actions in protecting that medical convoy have been formally recognized. He's being awarded the Bronze Star for valor." The news should have filled me with pride for Marcus, and it did, but it also highlighted the fundamental asymmetry between our types of service. His single act of courage would be recognized with a medal and ceremony, while my years of preventing attacks would remain forever invisible, hidden behind classifications that would outlive us both. "Your family doesn't need to know the specific details of yesterday's operation," General Morrison continued, "but they should understand that what you do matters on a scale they might not comprehend. The work you perform isn't just important, it's irreplaceable." As I hung up the phone and walked toward my parents' front door, I carried the weight of that responsibility like armor.
400 lives saved in the past 24 hours, countless others protected by intelligence work that stretched back years. But I also carried the knowledge that explaining this to my family would require navigating security classifications and operational constraints that turned simple conversations into potential breaches of national security. My mother answered the door before I could knock, as if she'd been watching from the window. Her face showed the strain of the past day, the kind of exhaustion that came from having your entire understanding of reality suddenly reorganized. "Sophia," she said, and just the way she pronounced my name carried more weight than it had ever had before. There was uncertainty there, but also something that might have been respect, as if she was speaking to someone she was still learning to recognize. The house felt different as I walked through the familiar hallway toward the kitchen. The furniture was the same, the family photos still lined the walls in their familiar arrangements, but the atmosphere had changed in ways I couldn't quite identify. It was as if learning about my real work had somehow altered the fundamental character of the space where I'd grown up. Dad was sitting at the kitchen table, the same spot where he'd held countless family meetings over the years, but his usual commanding presence seemed subdued, replaced by something more thoughtful and uncertain. He looked up when I entered, and I saw him making a conscious effort to really see me, as if he was trying to reconcile the daughter he'd known with the person he'd learned about yesterday. "Sophia," he said, standing up with a formality that felt strange in our family kitchen, "thank you for coming." Mom bustled around making coffee and setting out plates, the familiar ritual of hospitality that she used to manage family tension, but her movements were more careful than usual, as if she was aware that this conversation would be different from any we'd had before. "I've been thinking," Dad said once we were all sitting around the table, "about what that nurse told us yesterday, about what you've been doing all these years." He paused, running his hands through his graying hair in a gesture I'd seen countless times when he was struggling with difficult concepts. "I need to understand something. How long have you been lying to us?" The question was direct and painful, cutting straight to the heart of the deception that had defined our relationship for years. I could have deflected, could have explained it in terms of operational security and professional requirements. But sitting in my childhood kitchen, facing parents who were genuinely trying to understand, I decided on honesty. 6 years, I said simply, since I was recruited out of graduate school. Mom's coffee cup rattled against its saucer as she set it down with shaking hands. 6 years. 6 years of thinking you were struggling to find your place in the world, of worrying about your career prospects, of making excuses for why you couldn't hold down a steady teaching position. "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it. "I know how difficult this must be to process." Dad leaned forward, his expression intense with the effort of trying to understand something completely outside his experience. "Yesterday, that nurse called you one of the most valuable intelligence assets in the military. She said you've briefed cabinet members and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. How is that possible? How does someone go from substitute teacher to briefing generals?" I looked around the kitchen at these two people who'd raised me, who had fed me at this same table thousands of times, who'd celebrated my achievements and worried about my failures without ever knowing what those achievements and failures actually were. "I was never really a substitute teacher," I admitted. "That was always cover. My real job involves analyzing communication intercepts from terrorist organizations, identifying attack patterns, and providing threat assessments to senior military leadership." The words sounded almost absurd spoken aloud in the domestic comfort of my parents' kitchen. The gap between the mundane setting and the classified world I was describing felt vast enough to swallow everything familiar about our family relationships. "The conferences you attended, the professional development trips, the weeks when you disappear without much explanation, classified briefings, strategic planning sessions, operations that I can't discuss even now." Dad was quiet for a long time, staring at his coffee while processing information that challenged everything he thought he understood about his daughter's life. When he finally looked up, his expression was unlike anything I'd ever seen from him. "Sophia, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Have people died because of the work you do?" The question hung in the air like smoke from an explosion.
I could hear the tick of the kitchen clock, the distant sound of traffic on the street, outside, the whisper of the refrigerator cycling on, but from the three of us sitting around that table, there was only heavy silence. Yes, I said finally. People have died because of intelligence I've provided. Terrorist operatives who were targeted based on my analysis, enemy combatants who were eliminated using information I helped develop. Dad nodded slowly, as if this answer confirmed something he'd suspected. And how many people have lived because of your work? This was the harder question, the one that required me to quantify something that couldn't really be measured. How do you count lives saved by attacks that never happened, families protected by threats that were neutralized before they could be developed, soldiers who returned home safely because intelligence analysis allowed them to avoid ambushes? Thousands, I said quietly. Maybe tens of thousands. The attacks I've helped prevent, the intelligence that's protected American forces overseas, the threat assessments that have guided policy decisions. The numbers are classified, but they're significant. Mom was crying now, quiet tears streaming down her face as she struggled to process the reality of what her daughter had been doing while she'd been worrying about my ability to hold down a steady job. All those times you seemed distant. All those periods when you'd come home from your trips and seem exhausted and stressed. We thought it was because you were struggling professionally.
I was carrying information about planned attacks on American citizens, I said gently. Intelligence about threats that could have killed hundreds of people if they hadn't been stopped. It's difficult to come home and make small talk about the weather when you've spent the week analyzing terrorist communications. Dad was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something that went beyond simple surprise into territory that might have been awe. Yesterday, when that general showed up at the hospital and said she needed you immediately, that was real. That wasn't for show. Syria, I confirmed, coordinated attacks on 6 American installations. We had partial intelligence, but needed pattern analysis to understand the full scope of the threat. And you stopped it? My team stopped it. I provided analysis that allowed military commanders to reposition assets and intercept the attacks before they could be launched. The silence that followed was different from the shocked quiet of the previous day. This was contemplative silence, the kind that came when people were trying to reorganize their entire understanding of someone they thought they knew completely. Sophia, Dad said finally, his voice carrying a weight I'd never heard before. I owe you an apology, a big one. I felt something tighten in my chest, a mixture of hope and apprehension. In 31 years, I couldn't remember my father ever apologizing to me for anything, ever acknowledging that his treatment of me might have been unfair or hurtful. All those years, he continued, I dismissed what you were doing. I treated you like you were the family underachiever, the daughter who couldn't find her place in the world. I made jokes about your job, minimized your contributions, acted like Marcus was the only one of my children who was really serving their country. He paused, struggling with words that clearly didn't come easily. I was wrong. Not just wrong, but completely, fundamentally wrong about who you are and what you've been doing with your life. The apology hit me with unexpected force. After years of feeling invisible in my own family, of watching my father celebrate Marcus's achievements while dismissing mine, hearing him acknowledge his mistake felt like being offered oxygen after years of holding my breath. Dad, I said, but he held up his hand to stop me. Let me finish, he said. Yesterday, when that nurse explained what you've been doing, when that general showed up and talked about how valuable your work is, I realized something terrible. I realized that I've spent years being proud of having a son who serves his country while completely failing to recognize that I also have a daughter who serves her country. Mom was still crying, but now her tears seemed to carry different emotions. Pride, maybe, mixed with regret for all the years she'd worried about my prospects instead of understanding what I was actually accomplishing. The worst part, Dad continued, is that you've been protecting people like Marcus. The intelligence you provide, the analysis you do, it's been keeping American soldiers safe overseas, including your brother.
I thought about Lieutenant Commander Hayes's revelation about how my intelligence work had provided the briefings that gave Marcus the knowledge he needed to save those Marines. The circular nature of our service, each of us protecting the other in ways we'd never understood, felt like some kind of cosmic justice. When I think about all the times I bragged about Marcus's service, Dad said, his voice thick with emotion, all the times I told people about having a son in the military while dismissing your work as paperwork and filing, I feel ashamed. Not just embarrassed, but genuinely ashamed of how I treated you. The words I'd waited my entire life to hear were finally being spoken, but they came with complications I hadn't anticipated. Along with the relief and validation, I felt a deep sadness for all the years we'd lost to misunderstanding, all the opportunities for connection that had been sacrificed to operational security. There's something else, I said, because the conversation had moved into territory where complete honesty seemed possible. The work I do, it's not just about analyzing threats from overseas. Some of it involves domestic terrorism, threats against American installations and personnel here in the United States. Dad's expression sharpened with attention. What kind of threats? I can't discuss specifics, but the intelligence community doesn't distinguish between foreign and domestic when it comes to protecting American lives. Terrorists who plan attacks on American soil, extremist groups that target military installations, cyber threats against critical infrastructure. It's all connected. Mom set down her coffee cup with a sound that seemed too loud in the quiet kitchen. Sophia, are you saying that you've been protecting us here at home? The question was more complex than she realized. My work involved analyzing threats that could affect anyone, anywhere in the country. Every attack prevented, every threat neutralized, contributed to a security environment that protected millions of Americans, including my own family. In a way, yes, I said. The work I do is designed to keep all Americans safe, wherever they are. Dad was quiet for a long time, processing this information with the careful attention he'd once given to military briefings. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a gravity that made the kitchen feel like a briefing room. Sophia, I need to ask you something else. This work you do, is it dangerous? Not just professionally, but personally. Are you at risk? The question touched on aspects of my work that I couldn't discuss, even with family members who now knew about my general role. There were operational security considerations, classification levels that protect not just sources and methods, but also the safety of personnel in sensitive work. All intelligence work carries some level of risk, I said carefully, but I work primarily in analysis, not field operations. Most of my job involves computers and communication intercepts, not direct contact with hostile actors. It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the complete truth either. My analytical work had made me a target for terrorist organizations that monitored American intelligence activities. My name appeared on watch lists maintained by groups that considered intelligence analysts to be legitimate military targets. The security measures that protected me were invisible but comprehensive, covering everything from my daily routines to my family safety. The reason I'm asking, Dad said, is that I want to understand what we need to do differently now that we know about your real work. Are there security considerations for the family? Things we need to be aware of or careful about? His question demonstrated a level of tactical thinking that reminded me he'd spent 22 years in military service, even if his role had been largely administrative. He understood that intelligence work created security implications that extended beyond the individual analyst. There are some precautions, I admitted. Nothing dramatic, but basic operational security. Being careful about what you discuss on phones or in emails, being aware of who might be listening to conversations about my work, understanding that there are things I can't discuss even with family. Mom looked alarmed. Are we in danger? Should we be worried about our safety? No, I said quickly, though I realized the question was more complicated than a simple yes or no answer could address. The security measures that protect my work also protect the people close to me, but it's important that you understand the sensitivity of what you now know. Dad nodded with the kind of serious attention he'd once given to classified briefings during his own military service. What kind of precautions are we talking about? Don't discuss my work with neighbors, friends, or extended family. Don't post anything on social media that references my government job in specific terms. Be aware that phones and emails can be monitored, so avoid detailed discussions of anything related to my actual responsibilities. Mom looked alarmed. Are we in danger? Should we be worried about our safety? No, I said quickly, though I realized the question was more complicated than a simple yes or no answer could address. The security measures that protect my work also protect the people close to me, but it's important that you understand the sensitivity of what you now know. Dad nodded, with the kind of serious attention he'd once given to classified briefings during his own military service. What kind of precautions are we talking about? Don't discuss my work with neighbors, friends, or extended family. Don't post anything on social media that references my government job in specific terms. Be aware that phones and emails can be monitored, so avoid detailed discussions of anything related to my actual responsibilities. Mom looked alarmed. Are we in danger? Should we be worried about our safety? No, I said quickly, though I realized the question was more complicated than a simple yes or no answer could address. The security measures that protect my work also protect the people close to me, but it's important that you understand the sensitivity of what you now know. Dad nodded, with the kind of serious attention he'd once given to classified briefings during his own military service. What kind of precautions are we talking about? Don't discuss my work with neighbors, friends, or extended family. Don't post anything on social media that references my government job in specific terms. Be aware that phones and emails can be monitored, so avoid detailed discussions of anything related to my actual responsibilities.
The conversation was moving into territory that felt more like a security briefing than a family discussion, but I could see that my parents were taking it seriously. Years of military life had taught them to respect classification levels and operational security requirements. There's something else, I said, because the conversation had created an opening for complete honesty. My work involves periodic travel to locations I can't discuss, briefing personnel I can't identify, and handling information that will remain classified for decades. Even now that you know about my general role, there will still be times when I can't explain where I'm going or what I'm doing. Mom reached across the table and took my hand, her grip firm and warm. Sophia, we understand. Or at least, we're trying to understand. What matters is that we know the truth now, even if we can't know all the details. Dad was studying me with an expression that combined pride and concern in ways I'd never seen before. Yesterday, when you left with that general, when you said this was what you do and who you are, I realized something. I've been looking at military service through a very narrow lens, thinking that the only way to serve your country was through direct combat or traditional military roles. He paused, struggling with concepts that challenged his lifelong assumptions about duty and service. But what you do, the intelligence work and analysis, it's just as important as what any soldier does in the field. Maybe more important because you're preventing conflicts before they start. The recognition hit me with unexpected emotional force. After years of feeling like my service didn't count because it wasn't visible or publicly acknowledged, having my father finally understand the value of intelligence work felt like being welcomed into a club I'd been trying to join my entire life. There's one more thing I need to tell you, I said, because the momentum of honesty seemed too valuable to waste. My job has advancement opportunities, promotion potential, and career paths that could lead to senior positions in the intelligence community. The substitute teaching was just cover, but my real career has been progressing the entire time. Mom's eyes widened with understanding. All those times we worried about your professional prospects, about whether you'd ever find stable employment, you were actually building a career in national security. The director of the Defense Intelligence Agency started as an analyst like me, I confirmed. The work I do now could eventually lead to briefing the president, overseeing major intelligence operations, or managing programs that protect national security on a global scale. Dad was quiet for a long moment, processing implications that went far beyond what he'd imagined possible for his daughter. Sophia, are you saying that you could someday be running the kind of intelligence operations that brief generals and cabinet members? It's possible, I said. My performance evaluations have been excellent, and there are career development programs specifically designed to prepare analysts for senior leadership roles. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of Dad's phone ringing, the distinctive tone he used for important calls.
He glanced at the screen, and I saw his expression change, shifting from thoughtful family discussion mode to something more formal and alert. "Colonel Martinez," he answered, his voice automatically taking on the crisp professionalism of his military years. I could hear the voice on the other end, though not clearly enough to make out specific words, but I could tell from Dad's responses that this was some kind of official call, something related to military business. "Yes, sir," Dad said, his posture straightening, even though he was sitting in his own kitchen. "I understand, sir. Thank you for calling personally." When he hung up, his face showed a mixture of pride and amazement that made me wonder what kind of conversation he'd just had. "That was Colonel Martinez from the Pentagon," he said slowly. "He wanted to inform me personally that Marcus is being awarded the Bronze Star for his actions in protecting that medical convoy." The news was wonderful but not surprising, given what General Morrison had told me earlier. Marcus's heroism deserved recognition, and the Bronze Star was appropriate acknowledgement for risking his life to save fellow soldiers. But that's not why he called, Dad continued, his voice taking on a tone I'd never heard before. He called because he wanted to make sure I understood something about the intelligence that made Marcus's heroism possible. I felt something cold settle in my stomach as I realized where this conversation was heading. Colonel Martinez told me that the tactical briefing Marcus received, the intelligence analysis that allowed him to recognize and avoid that IED pattern, came from some of the most classified threat assessment work being done anywhere in the government. Dad was looking directly at me now, his expression showing complete understanding for the first time in our relationship. He said that the analyst who provided that intelligence analyst had personally prevented dozens of attacks on American forces, and that her work was considered so valuable that she briefed senior military leadership on a regular basis. The silence in the kitchen was profound and complete. Mom was staring at me with an expression of dawning comprehension, while Dad was continuing to process the implications of what he'd just learned. "He didn't mention any names," he said quietly, but he made it clear that the person responsible for that intelligence analyst was someone whose work had saved hundreds of American lives. I sat there in my parents' kitchen, surrounded by the familiar comforts of childhood, while my father finally understood the full scope of what his daughter had been doing while he'd been dismissing her as an underachiever. "Sophia," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "your work saved your brother's life, and the lives of those Marines he protected, and probably countless other soldiers we'll never know." The circular nature of it was almost poetic. My intelligence work had provided the briefings that gave Marcus the knowledge he needed to be a hero, while his heroism gave meaning to analysis that might otherwise have remained abstract data points in classified reports. "I'm proud of both of you," Dad said finally, his voice carrying more weight than any words he'd ever spoken to me. "I'm proud of Marcus for his courage under fire, and I'm proud of you for the work that made his courage effective." Mom was crying again, but these were different tears, cleaner somehow, carrying relief and pride instead of confusion and regret. "All those years," she said through her tears, "we thought one of our children was a hero and the other was still finding her way. We never understood that we had two heroes working together to protect people they'd never meet." As we sat around that kitchen table, finally seeing each other clearly for the first time in years, I realized that something fundamental had changed in our family dynamic. The deception that had separated us was gone, replaced by understanding that went deeper than simple recognition of achievement. My parents finally knew who I really was, and for the first time in my adult life, I didn't have to choose between my professional identity and my family relationships. The two parts of my life that had been completely separate for 6 years were finally coming together in ways that felt sustainable and genuine. But even as I felt the relief of finally being seen and understood by my family, I knew that this was only the beginning of a much larger transition. Tomorrow, I would have to give Agent Sarah Kim my decision about how to proceed with my career and my cover identity. The conversation with my parents had given me clarity about what I wanted, but implementing that decision would require navigating bureaucratic and security challenges that made family meetings seem simpler by comparison. For tonight, though, it was enough to sit in my childhood kitchen with parents who finally understood what their daughter did for a living and who were proud of her for the first time in ways that felt completely genuine. The story of Agent Sophia Chen was evolving in directions I'd never anticipated, but for the first time in years, all the different versions of myself were finally pointing in the same direction. 3 months later, I stood in the same Pentagon briefing room where this journey had begun, but everything had changed. The controlled transparency protocol had been approved, implemented, and was working better than anyone had expected. My family now understood the gravity of my work without knowing operational details that could compromise security. Dad had become my most vocal supporter, though he learned to express that pride carefully. At Marcus's Bronze Star ceremony, when people asked about his daughter, he would simply say, "I worked in national security," and leave it at that. The restraint was difficult for him, but he understood the stakes. Marcus recovered fully and returned to active duty, but our relationship had transformed completely. We were no longer the golden child and the disappointment. We were partners in service, each protecting the other in ways that created an unbreakable bond. The morning briefing concluded with news that another coordinated attack had been prevented, this time targeting American embassies in Eastern Europe. My analysis had identified the threat pattern 48 hours before execution. Lives saved, families protected, all in the invisible victory that had become my specialty. Agent Sarah Kim approached with new assignment folders. "Ready for the next mission, Agent Chen?" I smiled, thinking about the dinner invitation from my parents waiting on my phone, the text from Marcus asking about my weekend plans, the life that finally felt whole and authentic. "Always ready," I replied.